Really, the only way to start this video is to talk about my relationship with the original Panasonic GH5. It was my third or fourth Micro Four Thirds camera at the time. I went from a G7 to a G85 to a GH4, and then from the GH4 I jumped to the GH5. Look, at the end of the day, I've just loved everything there is to love about Micro Four Thirds. I always thought for bang for your buck in terms of video features and specs, there really wasn't much else out on the market giving what the GH5 gives you. We're talking like 4K 10-bit, unlimited recording times and a lot of various different bit rates, and it was just doing things that cameras maybe only in the last year or so have caught up to. And for that, I think the GH5 will always go down in history as such a legendary camera for its time. And on top of that, even the GH4 was a good 3 or 4 years ahead of its time when it came out too. So now that the GH5 II has come out, we have this like Mark II version. I think a little bit of disappointment has come across people when they found out the news around this camera. That was such a strange way to say that sentence. I think people have been a bit disappointed with the announcement of the GH5 II because the GH5 is so bloody legendary. We're all expecting the next gift from God with this camera, and to have just an incremental update to something we already love can feel sad and disappointing. But I think we just haven't really gone down the path enough to understand what they're doing and the overarching plan that Panasonic seems to have for Micro Four Thirds. So that's what I want to talk about in this video. I think we got to look at the GH5 II a little bit differently. We got to look at it more like the Canon 5D, right? So like 5D Mark I, 5D Mark II, 5D Mark III, 5D Mark IV. If you had the Mark II or the Mark III, you know, if you had the Mark III, you probably weren't upgrading to the Mark IV. There's different incremental updates that come to these cameras, but they don't discount the previous generation. And really with this Mark II GH5, it's just building upon the things that we already like. It's adding a few more bells and whistles to a camera that was already great. And it doesn't make the GH5 worse, it just makes the GH5 even better, and it probably whets our appetite even more for what a GH6 could be. I'm also not going to really dive into the technical details of what differentiates the GH5 from the GH5 Mark II. I just want to talk about the features that have come to this camera that I found useful, that I actually really enjoyed in the few weeks that I had it on loan from Panasonic. So the first thing, and I think this is going to be probably the most controversial thing that I say in this whole video, but I think the autofocus is actually pretty good with Panasonic cameras now. Of course, I've been using the S5 for a long time now, a few months. Long time is a few months apparently in my world, because time doesn't even exist anymore because it's all a construct and we have no idea what time even is. All we know is that it moves forward and we're all slowly dying. But I have had the Panasonic S5 for a while, and I have been using it in autofocus for a plethora of different projects. There's a video that I did with my buddy Lee Zavitz where I shot behind the scenes for him. That was entirely in autofocus, and I think it did a really bang up job. Now, for you, your mileage may absolutely vary. If I'm gonna say you want the best autofocus, I would look at Fuji, I would look at Sony, I would look at Canon. I'm not here saying Panasonic has the best autofocus system for video. What I am saying is we need to start considering it as an option that might work for you. It works for me. I do a lot of the stuff that I'm sure a lot of you do. I'm not unique in any way in that capacity. That'll prove my point. Because I had the S5 and I had the GH5 II, I did a little bit of a quick autofocus test. So let me show you the 10-25 f1.7 on the GH5 II compared to the Lumix S5 with that new 50mm f1.8 lens, which I actually think did a pretty nice job for autofocus as well. And we did face detect, we did some stuff where you put your hand up, and you can just judge for yourself if you think the autofocus is good enough for you. Like I said, for me, I do think it's more than usable for YouTube purposes and the occasional client job, depending on what is required of you. Like I said, is the autofocus absolutely perfect? No, but I just think in situations which is practical and how you would use it, if you're doing a talking head video like this, if you're doing something with a client that's more run and gun documentary, I would be comfortable leaving this thing in autofocus. Of course, you can just quickly switch that thing to manual when you need to get a critical focus, but for general use case scenarios, I do think Panasonic has done a really good job with the algorithm. Whatever updates that they've done to these cameras to figure that out, even though they are using a contrast-based system, of course, I'd love to see them get into phase detect. And really, we all keep saying, if they just nail autofocus, they will have probably the best cameras on the market right now. But if you can just look over that hurdle in your head right now where you're like, oh, you know, I want this camera because it does everything I want it to do and it's cheap and it's affordable, but the autofocus sucks, I'm telling you, it's probably a lot better than you're anticipating. So if you can get your hands on one, definitely try it out, whether it's the S5, GH5 II, that BGH1 we reviewed not too long ago, that also had solid autofocus. Now the next more real world practical thing would be the IBIS. Now GH5 and most Micro Four Thirds cameras with internal image body stabilization have always been the kings of internal image body stabilization. So now the GH5 II is doing 6.5 stops of IBIS versus the 5 stops on the GH5. Now, the S5 also has internal image body stabilization, so I did compare the two, and it's really no contest. The GH5 II is blowing the S5 out of the water in terms of IBIS at the same focal lengths. Now, this isn't a completely fair comparison, but just knowing what it's like to use these cameras, the GH5 and the GH5 II definitely still have class-leading internal image body stabilization. We haven't hit that front yet on full frame. Yes, the S5 has really nice IBIS, and even Sony and Canon are doing some half decent stuff with IBIS too, but king of IBIS is definitely still the GH5, and the GH5 II just makes the IBIS even better. This next feature that they've added to this camera, I think, is the most interesting part of the GH5 II, and that is the live streaming capabilities. Look, I'm not someone that live streams, but I am very familiar with that world, and I think that Panasonic has done something really cool with the GH5 II when it comes to live streaming. Basically, all you need is a phone, the camera, and an internet connection, and you can now live stream up to 1080/30 in real time, essentially, straight from the camera and your phone. I think that is so nice for streamers to not have to deal with cables and dongles and capture cards and all that kind of stuff. It's just as simple as setting the camera up, setting your phone up, using the Lumix Sync app that they gave me a beta test for. It was so simple that, like, I was actually going into it thinking this is gonna be a real pain. Just knowing how most of these camera companies work with these apps and stuff, it's just not always the most seamless experience. But this is one where I was like, I was proven wrong. This was extremely simple to set up. For me, I tested it with YouTube, and it was just as easy as signing in with YouTube, and I was ready to go. You can set your public, your unlisted, whatever you want to do, set the title for your live stream, everything. It's a couple taps and you're up and running, and the quality was fantastic. So I think, you know, if you're a live streamer and you're someone who wants a really simple setup you can take anywhere, if you want to start streaming outside of your home studio, you could go anywhere with this thing and stream. And I think that's so interesting and cool. And I would think it would be nice if they could add this feature to other Panasonic cameras. Like, part of me wonders why it hasn't just been an update for the S line or even potentially even the older GH5. It could be a processor issue, but I would say like the Lumix S5 or the S1 or the S1H could definitely probably get this in a software update. But that begs the question then, what is the real selling factor for the GH5 II then? Because if it's really just to be a slightly modified, you know, slightly better version of the GH5, it's a bit of a tough sell for me as a current GH5 owner. Now, if it's your first GH5, definitely go with the GH5 II. At $1,700, it is such a killer camera. The elephant in the room, though, and like this is where it gets really, really tricky and complicated, is the Lumix S5 exists. And you can get the Lumix S5 for under $2,000 still with that kit lens, and you have a fantastic full frame camera that really is a full frame GH5. And, you know, for me, now that I've, you know, spent 5 years or 4 years, whatever it is, with the GH5 going to the S5, there's never been a moment yet where I said, oh, I kind of wish I had the GH5 with me. You know, even when it comes to IBIS or anything else, the full frame, the fact that the image quality and the color, the full Vlog instead of Vlog L, all that stuff for me is much more valuable than better IBIS or anything like that. And the other thing is, like, if you look at these cameras, let me just grab this other one here. Here is the S5. And here is the GH5. And like, truly, from a size comparison standpoint, if it's a mobility issue, like, I still think the S5 is the better buy. Like, you're getting so much more camera out of it. But like I said, if they don't bring these live streaming features to other cameras, this is a really interesting go-to creator camera. As an all-around kind of vlogging, live streaming camera, GH5 II is a solid bang for your buck at this price point. Again, because the S5 exists, you got to look at your lens options. You got to look at the world of what you want to use with this camera. There's a great case to be made in terms of compatibility with Micro Four Thirds being a lot easier to adapt whatever lens you want to that system. So you could save a ton of money on glass going Micro Four Thirds, or you could just buy a couple of lenses and go all out and spend maybe $3-4 and maybe have a better long-term investment as cameras all sort of go towards larger sensors. That being said, we also know that a GH6 is en route, so it might just be the best time to wait. And we've talked about on this channel all the time, I don't like waiting and it sucks, but we are on the cusp of this GH6, and I think it would be smart just to wait to see what that camera brings, because even though it's definitely going to be more expensive, it might just be enough of an upgrade to justify that price and hold out and have that camera for another 5 years. That GH6 will be the next GH5 really in terms of its future capabilities. It's a camera that will last with you and grow with you for a lot longer. At least that's my hypothesis right now. That's how I feel about the S5. And you know, even though the GH5 II is a nice upgrade over the GH5, I don't see as much of a long-term play with that camera. Like, it's a cool camera for maybe a year or two from now. Of course you could stretch it, you can use it as long as you want it, but as technology gets better, I think a GH6 or an S5 will probably be the better investment. So I know this video was a little bit all over the place and it didn't really have a super clear focus, but I hope that helps you understand my thinking around the GH5 II, and hopefully it'll help you decide if it's a camera for you, and it probably make you feel like your GH5 is still pretty solid and it's a camera you should hang on to. The GH5 is a camera I would even recommend picking up used. I've sold GH5s, I've bought GH5s numerous times over the last couple years. It's a camera that I just like having around. It's an easy one to grab for B-roll when I have to film another camera. I can't use my S5 if I have to film the S5, and my favorite camera to do that with is the GH5. So GH5, I feel like everybody should have one in their kit, so maybe your first GH5 could be the GH5 II. Now, if you have any questions or comments about the GH5 II, let me know in the comments. I gotta figure that out. I always say, if you have any questions or comments in the comments, that doesn't make any sense. If you have any questions about the GH5 II, let me know in the comments. Look, I figured that one out. If you have any questions about the Lumix S5, well, we're not talking about the S5, are we? We're talking about the GH5 II. If you have anything to say it in the comments, and you'll hear or see me next time I feel like making a video. Peace. I usually say cheers, and I'm not gonna redo it. So, cheers, peace.